Hi and welcome back. We are going to pick it up from the last point. We have already started on Introduction to MySQL. We are on a Django course, but then we decided to have a taste of how it feels interacting with a database directory. And that's how this course comes into existence. Okay, so in this session, we are going to look at another bit of introduction concepts. Okay, so in this session, we are now going to start interacting with a MySQL database. All right, the first thing is to install a MySQL database. All right, so this could be either on your local machine or have it on a server or have it being provided as a service. Okay, so you can think of AWS, which can give you a MySQL instance or any other service provider out there. All right, so again, we are not going to do the installation in this video, but you have the options. All right, so in case you want a specific method to install or set up your MySQL database, you can let us know in the comment section. All right, but in the meantime, we are going to make those videos available. So in my case, I already have installed a MySQL database in my Linux PC. Okay, so we are going to make use of what I have here. Okay, so once you have the installation in place, the next thing will be accessing your database. All right. And just to mention, there are so many ways of accessing your database, whether it's on my Linux machine, your Windows machine, or in any other machine out there. Okay. So in my case, I'll talk of sudo mysql. All right. Then I'll provide my password here. Okay, so that gives me the access to a MySQL interface. All right, so quite a number of things that we will be appreciating here. One of them is seeing a list of the available database that we have here. Okay, so if you want to see a list of the available database, you can talk of show databases. All right, of course, you can terminate with a semicolon. All right, so we see we have quite a number of databases. So in here, we are going to be creating our own database inside the MySQL database that we have already set up. Okay, so in here, let me talk of create database. Then we give our database a name. So let me talk of Django underscore training. Okay, so the command to create a database is create database, then you give your database a name. Okay, and again, it's a common practice that when talking about the MySQL syntax, you have it in uppercase. Okay, then anything else should be in lowercase. But then this is just a common practice. If you feel that it is too much for you to type in using uppercase, especially for what we have here, then you can just have them in lowercase. And that is what I'll be doing for the remaining part of this session. Because again, for us, I'll be mentioning the keywords and of course some variables that do change like what we have. I'll press enter and we see that query awk one row affected and the time it has taken to effect that command. All right, so if I go back to show databases, okay, so in this case I am making use of the show databases command, but in this case using lowercase. In here I used uppercase, which as I mentioned, it is the convention, but lowercase still works. Press enter and we see that we have our Django training database here. Okay, so let me do show databases again, right? So we said that we have the databases, and it is in these databases that we see here that we are going to create tables. All right, and it is from now the tables that we are going to store information and retrieve information from. All right, so think of a command to retrieve data from a table. Okay, of course, we have quite a number of databases here. All right, so to make our life easier when interacting with tables from a specific database, we need to reference that database. Okay, and we have a command that will now switch to that database. All right, let's see. So we are going to talk of use, then mention the database name. So we have talked about Django training. Okay, so this helps us kind of activate the database that we want to work with, because as you have seen, we have quite a number of databases here. Okay, so we want to reference one database, and from that point, we proceed to go about creating tables and retrieving data from those tables. So that's a command to switch to a specific database. All right. Okay, so in some instances, you might encounter something like shows that you have switched to Django training database. So in this case, we still see that we are in the primary database here. That's where we still have here. But in your case, you might see something like Django training somewhere here. Okay, and that's when you can easily tell that you have switched to what database. For now, we see that database has been changed. All right. So we may want to see what tables are in this database that we have selected. Okay. So let's talk of show tables. Okay. So this is a new database, no tables yet. Okay. So again, we are going to create a new table. All right. So let me again clear this. Okay. I want us to create a table. Okay, and we are going to pass in some pieces of information. Okay, so we are going to talk of create table, that's a command, then give your table a name. All right, so let's create a table of students. All right, then from here, this is again where we are going to define the columns. All right, remember we said that a table has columns and rows, but even before you insert any record in a table to get a row, you must have defined some columns. So these are the columns that we are defining here. Okay, so let's start by defining the ID. So this is the table that we want to create. All right, so let's start by defining an ID. All right, then from this, the next thing that we should talk of is the data type. What data type do we expect for this ID? Right? For that data type, let's talk of integer. So in this case, let me make use of the uppercase to distinguish between the name and these other constraints. All right. Then the other constraint that we can pass here is that we would want this ID, instead of passing it in manually, we want that whenever we add a new record, it should auto-populate a new ID. Okay, so that can be made possible by what we call auto increment. Okay, otherwise this can work without the auto increment, but then you'll have to be passing in the ID manually. But with this, whenever you pass in a new record, it will automatically increase the ID from previously. For instance, if you pass in 5 records and you want to pass in the sixth, it will have an ID 6, 7, 8, and so on and so on. Okay, then again, we would want to make this ID the primary key. Okay, I hope you remember what a primary key is. So I'll talk of primary key. All right. And for now, I hope we all know what all these represents. Okay. So that's for the ID. Okay. So if we move on, we see we have a first name here. All right. So let's have the first name. Okay. That's how to pass in a column name. All right. We don't expect to find first space name. Of course, we have a naming convention here that has to be followed. All right. Once we pass in the first name, then the next thing we should talk about is the data type. All right. We have already seen some two data types. And for the first name, we expect this to be a string. All right. But the question is, do we expect it to be a paragraph? No, we only expect to have some characters, some countable characters. So in this case, we are going to talk of vulture, all right? And in here, we can pass in the length, all right? So whatever value that you are passing in here should take into consideration the possibility of a first name having as many characters as you pass in there, all right? Okay, so the next thing, so that's for the first name, and we may not need to pass in any other constraint. All right. Then the other thing is the last name, which can as well take in what we have for the first name. So we can simply talk about vulture, and again we pass in 40. All right. Then a comma. Then the other thing we have is the age. So we can have the age, and for the age we can pass integer. All right. And of course we have all the other pieces of information that you can correct. All right, so that's a table. Then you terminate that with a semicolon and press enter. Okay, so we see query awk, 0 rows affected, and the time taken. So let's try to look at what tables we have for this database. So if we show tables, okay, so we see that we have a table called students. That's the name that we gave it here. All right. So if you want to see a description of the columns for this table, we can talk about describe students. So look for the fields. We have the ID, first name, last name, and age. This is exactly what we passed in here. Okay. Then we have the column type, which again tells us the types of each of these fields that we have defined. All right. Then there is another constraint that we never mentioned. Okay. So this is null. And for the ID, it does not accept a null value. All right. But for the first name, we can pass in a null value, same as the other fields. All right. Of course, if we wanted to change that, we would have set it up here or do an update so that it prevents passing in of null values. All right. Then for the primary key, this is the key in question. We see that the ID is a primary key. All right. Then again, we haven't passed in any default values. So that's why we see that no default values defined. All right. For the extra, we see that the ID has been set to auto increase. So that's the structure of our table. Okay. So the next thing is now inserting data into our database. Okay, because you all know that we have not yet inserted any data into our database. So we can try to look at if there is any information in our database. So for us to see the information in our table, we can talk of select star, which means all, and all in this case means all columns, okay, from the table. So mention the table name, we have students. Okay, we see that it is empty. All right, so as I mentioned, this star simply stands in for all these columns: ID, first name, last name, and age. If for instance we wanted to get hold of the ID only, we would have talked select ID from students. Of course, for now, we do not have any record. That's why we get empty set. Okay, so let's now see how to go about inserting data into our table. Okay, so let me do some system clear here. We already have a table called students. So to insert data into this table, this is how we can do it. Let's talk of insert into, okay, then mention the table name, which happens to be students. All right, what do you want to insert? We want to insert the first name. So in here, after talking about insert into, mention the name of the table. All right, then into parentheses, mention the columns. All right, so the column, we have the ID, the first name, last name, and age. But for the ID, we set it to auto increase. So we do not need to mention it here. All right, so we are going to talk of first name. All right, then we have the last name. Okay, and finally we have the age. So those are the columns that we are going to pass in the data. All right, then have a space and talk about values. Okay, do that. Have some parentheses. So in here, you are going to pass in the data in the order in which you defined it here. Okay, so for the first name, I can talk of admin. All right, then the last name, we can talk of. So that's the last name. And for the age, we have 13 years old. So in this case, you do not have to pass in 13 in quotes because if you remember, we defined age as an integer. So the system does not expect us to pass in a string in place of an integer. So we are going to pass in 13 as it is. All right, then we can simply terminate that with some semicolons and press enter. Okay, then we see that it was a success. So we can try to view what is in the table. So let's talk of select all from students. Look, we want to select all, everything from the table name. Press enter and we see that we have the ID, first name, last name, and age. Just the same thing that we have passed in here. All right. Okay, so we may want to pass in, say, some multiple records. Okay, so the way to do that, we are going to talk of insert into students, which happens to be our table name. Okay, then we have that and pass in the names of the columns. All right, then press enter. Okay, so it will give you an option of now entering the values. Okay, then you can press enter, and in here we can now pass in the data that we want to save in our database here. Okay, so let me talk of. So to pass in another record within the same line, you pass in a comma, press enter. Okay, then I can simply do this. Once you are done passing in the records, terminate that with a semicolon, press enter. Of course, see that 2 records have been added. Okay, so if we talk of select, we want to select everything from students. Okay, we see a list of the students information from our students table. Okay, all right, so the next thing that I would want us to appreciate is we want to update some record. Okay, so we see there is this student named admin senior and they are 13 years old. Okay, we have found out that they are actually 25 years old. So we want to set this age to 25. Okay, and this is a disclaimer for the update command because you might have 1,000 records in that table. And in the update command, if you fail to mention the specific data that needs to get that update, it will end up updating your 1,000 records in that table. Okay, so we have update. What do you want to update? We want to update the students table. All right, then what row do you want to update? We want to set age to 23 or to 25, whichever. This is the age that you want to update. This one. Okay, so you set the age to that. Okay, then if you execute this command as it is, it will update the age of each of these records to 23. So remember, you have to set that condition where, okay, ID is equals to 1. So whatever field that you set here, ensure that it is the primary key. Okay, of course, you can also make use of the first name, but be sure to be cautious of the users with that first name that you'll set. Because, for instance, if you set admin, yet there are 10 students with the first name as admin, and you only intended to change for this particular admin, then that will mess you up because it will update for all users with the first name admin. So that's why it is advisable to use the primary key unless you want to change for users who share, say, some common characteristics. Say first name, they are all admins. Okay, last name, they are all seniors. Or age is less than 10, so you want to set it to some specific value. So in this case, we only want to update for the user with ID 1. Once we are happy with that, terminate with a semicolon, press enter. Okay, so let's try to select all from students. Okay, so let's see the student with the ID 1, the age have been updated to 23. All right. Okay, so let me clear my screen here. And if we look at that, remember, there is this star that we are using. Remember, we said you can simply talk of select first name from student. Okay, should be students. All right, so that only fetches the first names. And of course, there are so many ways in which you can play around with these command, either to give you student whose age is below or above a set of value. But for now, we are not gonna go into that. All right. So the other thing that I want to bring to your attention is how to delete a record. Okay. So again, you should also be cautious when deleting a record. Be sure to specify what is to be deleted. So to delete a record, so delete, talk of from students, that's the table name, where for now we can still make use of ID is equals to give the ID. Okay, now that we have already utilized the ID, for now I make use of first name so that I can delete the user with the name done. Of course, if there are 10 users with that name, they will all be deleted. Okay, if you do that, we see that it was a success. Execute that. We see we no longer have that user. Okay, that's again how to delete a record. We may want to count the number of students that we have. So the command to do that, we can talk of select. We want to count all, okay, students from students. Okay, so again, we see that we only have 2 students, which for now we can simply count 1, 2, and that's what we have. So if we want to delete that table, remember we have a single table called students, and we want to delete the table together with its content. We simply talk of drop table, then mention the table name there. Okay, so if you show tables again, you get no table. So again, that's a dangerous command as it will not spare the information in your table. All right. And finally, we want to drop the database as well. Okay, so if we show databases, we have quite a number of them. Let's try to delete the current one, and the same command we use, we talk of, then mention the name of your database, the database that you want to delete. Pass it in there. Okay, do that. We no longer see Django training. All right. And I believe that's a good introduction to get us started and to give us a foundation or a clear picture of what will be happening whenever we are dealing with Django models. You liked it? All right. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and drop your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you and goodbye.